Hello, everyone. Welcome to the brand new podcast for the love of books, a show all about books and their authors. Because who doesn't love to escape into the magic world of books and or chocolate? The podcast features indie and small press authors who navigate the pioneer and sometimes treacherous waters of self-publishing. I will be your host, Emma, and we're going to have a great show with an awesome guest lineup from all over the world. It is my pleasure to introduce my guest, Canadian mystery author Luba Lesychyn. Luba worked for Canada's largest museum, the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, for more than 20 years. She is the author of two books, Theft by Chocolate and its sequel, Theft Between the Rains. Hello, Luba. How are you?
Hello, Emma. Nice to be here.
Awesome. Glad to have you here. First of all, tell us, how did you get into the Canada's largest museum that obviously inspired your work? Or in other words, what is it like to be a glamorous museum employee? That just fascinates me.
Gosh, I haven't talked about how I first was hired in a while, but I actually, back in the day when you used to look for jobs in newspapers, and there was the tiniest little ad, I mean, I swear, just a couple of lines, and they were looking for someone with my computer experience, because that's what we used to call our personal computers back then. And I just happened to have had the tiniest bit of training, and they were looking for this person with this skill for their education department. And so I got an interview, and they actually almost didn't hire me because I was overqualified. I'd had a master's degree in history.
Yeah.
That I wouldn't stay in the job because it was a little bit more of a mundane job description, but they liked me enough to take a chance on me, and I ended up staying at the museum for more than 20 years. But I moved around to a number of different jobs within the museum, so I was always learning something, always doing something fascinating, and I had a lot of exposure to a lot of different people in different departments, to a lot of behind the scenes. It wasn't, as I know you were tongue-in-cheek with the glamorous life of a museum employee. I wasn't in the curatorial section of the museum, which is what everybody, I think, thinks that's all that museums are about. I was doing administration. But as I said, that the jobs that I had gave me so much exposure to people in different places. And the longest period of time that I spent in a particular job was in the programs department, in what I consider the Royal Ontario Museum's golden age of programming. And we were doing everything from film programming, book launches, children's and adults programs that included field trips and workshops. So I just got to meet a lot of people, got to work in a lot of different departments, but the department where I worked that has inspired the particular scenes in my two books was a department called Cultural Innovations, and we provided consulting services to museums around the world. And it was a really small team of people, really interesting group, but we were just a few people trying to do a really big job. So I was always having a lot of adventures or things going wrong, and I was stressed, so I was eating chocolate a lot. So that ended up coming into my work as well, in terms of my main character being a chocolate addict, and bringing that particular aspect of myself into my writing as well, to make a little light of.
So is that main character actually you? Is it based on you, or is it you?
Well, I would say it's inspired by myself. No, it's definitely a lot of similarities, but I definitely took a lot of literary license in terms of things that happened in the book were definitely from my imagination. But in terms of the parts of the book where I present the way things are done in a museum, or describe what an office might look like, or what a job might be like, is definitely drawn from my personal experiences there.
Okay. And the first book is inspired by a real life and never solved art theft at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. So tell me about that, the genesis of that, and did that real happen? I mean, somebody really stole art?
That's correct, but I didn't have that in the first draft of my book. I actually took a creative writing program at Humber College, and I wrote a first draft there and worked with a writer, an established writer, one-on-one with it. And then, once you're finished it, you go off and do a rewrite. And I looked for a publisher, an agent for a while, couldn't find one. So the book literally sat on my computer for at least a year, if not two, before I came back to it. And I happened, and at that point, I was working at a college, a Toronto college, George Brown College, and we were building a new campus, and we were working with a number of consultants. One of them was a security consultant, and we just happened to start talking one day, and I told him that I had worked at the ROM, and he told me about how his family had been in the security business in Toronto for a couple of generations. And he had some interesting and very little known information about a real life heist that had taken place at the ROM in the 1980s. Most people who worked at the museum knew about this. There are sort of small heists that take place at almost any museum. Sometimes it's just construction workers who are coming in and decide that they're going to walk out with an artifact thinking that they won't be caught. But this one, so as I said, took place a while before I had started working there. So it wasn't anything that we were talking about. But then this consultant had information that only someone in protective services or security business would know, and he shared that with me. So I went back to my book and I decided to write it into the story, and I ended up doing almost an entire rewrite in order to incorporate it because it was so fascinating. And I've always thought if I had the skills of a journalist, I would have loved to have done like a journalistic investigation into that, because they never caught the person who stole. It was a small collection of opals, and they were in a gem gallery where there were things that were much more valuable.
Okay.
So the belief is that it was designer heist. So someone was specifically targeting the opals for whatever sentimental reasons. And then after that, it had a little bit of its own story as well, because some of the pieces ended up on the black market in Hong Kong, and the Royal Ontario Museum was able to get them back and put them back into their collection. But it's never been solved. They don't know who it was, but the particular circumstances of how this thief bypassed the security system at the Royal Ontario Museum at that time. Remember, this is many decades ago. People in institutions and retail stores around the world were suddenly at risk, because if one person figured out how to circumvent it, then anyone could. So it literally changed the security technology globally because of this particular heist.
Okay.
So it's a fascinating story.
I mean, you did a complete rewrite, right?
I did.
So how long did that whole process from the initial version to the rewrite, how long did that take? So
the first draft took me about 10 months while I was in the writing programs, and then it took me another year to do the second draft. I was working by that point, so I was working full time, so I didn't have as much time to devote to it. And then, as I said, it rested for a couple of years or 1 or 2 years. And then the third rewrite with the opal heist probably took me another, it couldn't have been more than half a year, but I was working full time, so it's always hard to judge how much time it took. It was just because I didn't have as much time to devote to it. And I decided to try one more time to try to get it published.
So did you self-publish or traditionally?
As I mentioned, I couldn't find a publisher or agent initially. So then after I did the rewrite, it was, again, just, we always call these things fluke or chance, I like to call it synchronicity. I just happened to have heard about this amazing women's fiction festival in southern Italy. And in part of the conference, they have pitch sessions with publishers and agents. And I thought, well, geez, I could go on a vacation to Italy and go to this women's fiction conference, pitch the book, and if nothing happens, at least I'll have gotten like an amazing vacation out of it. So I decided to give it a chance, and the conference takes place, other than in times of the pandemic, annually in a beautiful, beautiful town and UNESCO World Heritage Site called Matera.
Okay.
And I pitched it there. I pitched it very poorly, I thought, and I'm not being intentionally humble or wanting to seem self-deprecating, but I really was a bundle of nerves. It's like speed dating with publishers and agents, and
Yes.
you one to the other. And I just, I just was really nervous, was tongue-tied, and left feeling that I hadn't sort of made my point, but I came prepared with my sample chapters and query letters and all of that. And about a month after I returned home from that trip, I got a call from a publisher in the UK. They were actually a startup digital publisher. And so it was at a time when digital publishing was just starting to come onto our radar.
Mm-hmm.
And they picked me up, and then, again, synchronicity. One of the publishers was a chocolate lover, an addict herself, and so it really resonated with her, and she thought it was a lot of fun, and so it was a really good match.
Excellent. What year was that? What year was that?
That was around 2011. And then the book was published in the summer of 2012. And unfortunately, because it was that time of startups, the publishers didn't end up making a go of it. They did put out a number of books, but they ended up closing their doors in 2014. So the rights came back to me.
Okay.
So I had to republish it as an independently published.
As an independent?
Yeah, exactly. And had gone through some of the process, so it was a little bit less of a learning curve than it might have been for someone who, hadn't gone through that process in the first place. But it was still a lot to learn on my own, just in terms of, so many different things, from the technical things to tax issues and all of that, as I'm sure you're aware. So
yes. Okay, now on to your second book. I absolutely love the catch line on your back cover. I just love that. There's a front cover, back cover, and I'm going to read it. What would you do if you worked at a reputable international museum and artworks listed as still missing since World War II began showing up on your doorstep? Did that actually happen, or you totally made that up?
Oh my goodness! If that had really happened to me, then I don't I don't think I would have had the nerves for it. No, it's a completely fictional story, and drawn from two really different streams of thought that came to me. I'm a big film lover and a real fan of documentary film. So I was watching a film called Lost Rivers, which is about how urban rivers have largely been undergrounded and have become part of cities' sewer systems. And it reminded me of the fact, excuse me, that the Royal Ontario Museum is actually situated above one of these underground waterways. It's called Tattle Creek. And I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. And I thought, well, maybe there's a book in this, because frankly, after I finished Theft by Chocolate, even though I left a few loose ends, I didn't really think I was going to write a sequel to it. But people kept asking me about it. They liked my characters, and I was constantly getting asked by people when I would come up with the second book. So then I saw this documentary and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. And then not too long after that, I saw yet another documentary called The Rape of Europa, which is about the Nazi plunder of art during World War II. And I started to kind of, put together this idea of what, we see. I mean, I love movies like The Monuments Man and Woman in Gold and, art that was either confiscated or stolen in World War II. They fascinated me as well as I think a lot of people. And I thought, what if I turned that kind of upside down, and instead of someone discovering a work of art, it just starts showing up? And how can I make that intriguing and make it about, well, why are these artworks suddenly just appearing on this museum worker's doorstep, and how is she going to handle it? And is this part of a much bigger cache of art that was stolen during World War II? And one other thing that played into it is my parents had lived through the war in Europe, and my mother had ended up working in Germany. And she had told me about how at the end of the war, people were just grabbing everything. She was working in a hotel. She was still quite a young girl. She was actually kind of in a forced labor situation there. But she said, the war ended and people, allies included, were coming into the hotel, literally taking everything off the walls, taking furniture, anything that they could take and carry home with them. And so I just thought, we always sort of get a one-sided picture of how things might have been in history. And I never sort of thought of this aspect of it being a free-for-all for everyone. At the time, it was really chaotic. And so I wanted to bring in, that's not the focus of the book, but I did bring in elements of that storytelling from her into it.
That really happened. I've read a lot about that people just picked through it. Whatever was available, they took. Yeah.
For sure.
All over Europe. Tell us a little bit about your character, Marco.
Well, I'm surprised that he was the one that you were sort of fascinated by. But
I was from the beginning.
I mean, he was a lot of fun to write. He's mostly fictional, probably from a physical standpoint. I was inspired by someone that I had met who lived in my community a very long time ago, but he was not a security guard. But there were a lot of really wonderful guards at the museum, and many with really fascinating stories, who, and the way that they ended up at the museum was so different from so many people. Sometimes they were very educated people who just didn't want to work in the corporate world anymore, or just wanted to be around art all the time. So Marco was just someone that I thought might be a fun partner in crime solving with the main character, Kalina Boyko, and that I could also write in a little bit of a love interest and having, again, sort of flipping gender roles around, where you have a younger man who's a little bit awed by a slightly older woman, and she's kind of a reluctant cougar, so she's kind of putting him off all the time. But yeah, and just access to different information that a guard might have as opposed to some other kind of character in the museum. So a lot of fun to write.
So how much research did you have to do, and how challenging was that? Was that the most challenging part of writing both books, or?
It was different for each of the books. For the first one, I really was drawing from experiences. So there wasn't a lot of research. The research was already embedded in me of 20 years of working at the ROM. But for the second book, I was also sort of writing a love letter to the city of Toronto. So I highlighted not just the Royal Ontario Museum, but a lot of parts of the city that people don't often get to visit or are acquainted with, and even inhabitants of the city who might not know about some of these parts of the city. So I did a couple of summers of doing walking tours around Toronto and getting ideas. And there's an actual group in Toronto called Lost Rivers that are connected with a green community here in the city. And they do these wonderful walking tours, again, when those are available in different times in our lives. And so I was picking up ideas from that. I was doing research on on art that was stolen during World War II, and, coming up with these statistics that just blew my mind about how much is still missing and possibly at the bottom of lakes, and not just art, but actual cash and currency was taken as well. So there was more research for the second one than for the first.
Okay. So what do you feel sets you apart from other indie authors?
Well, I think I have found my niche by writing about a setting that I knew really well and that the general public as a whole doesn't have access to. People come to museums, they see the tip of the iceberg in terms of collections. It really is such a small percentage of what's on display and what's behind the scenes. And in Theft Between the Rains, you learn much more about how a lot of the collections are warehoused on a site quite distant from the museum and actually in another city as well, as I learned recently. And so I'm able to bring in these tidbits of information about the way museums run, the type of quirky but wonderful academics who work at museums, and bring in authenticity to all of that, because I experienced it for so long, and as I said, it sort of became ingrained in me, and I was able to share that wholeheartedly.
Okay, tell us about your indie experience. How has it changed from the very beginning until now?
Yeah, it's funny because when I was first publishing or first finished my first draft, when I was in the creative writing program, I was actually warned by my mentors that if I self-published, I would never have a writing career. It was considered vanity publishing, and that I shouldn't even consider it. So I really felt locked into that. And that's why I spent so much time looking for a traditional publisher and then dropping it for a while. And then things, as we all have seen, started to change very rapidly. And so by the time that I did have to self-publish Theft by Chocolate on my own, things were already, even within that 2 years from the first, when I published it traditionally, to self-publishing it, things had really progressed quite a bit. And then when I started to write Theft Between the Rains, I just decided right from the beginning to self-publish, and primarily because it took me a long time to write, and not because it's any different from the first book, but just that I was working full time, had lots of things going on. And so there was a big gap in between the two books. And by the time I was finished it, I was really anxious to get it out. And I didn't want to spend another year or two to find another publisher, which is often the minimum amount of time that an author should count on looking for one. And so I thought, I've had the experience of self-publishing the first book, and it just made more sense for me to publish it myself and get it out quickly, have more control over it, get a bigger cut of the royalties, because as we know, they're not large, especially with ebooks. And so it's nice to have that control. At the same time, I certainly recognize that there's some indie books are sometimes questioned that they might not be as much of a good quality book as a book that might be published by a traditional publisher. So I think it's important to have a good editor and an editorial process, not to do it yourself. You really need an outside eye, beta readers, people who can contribute to some flaws that they might see in the story that you wouldn't see. No matter how many times you read your own work, you're going to. I still sometimes will pull out my books when I do readings, and we'll find typos in them, even though I've gone over them again
over and over again.
Times, and I'm sure every writer has
experienced that. Oh yes. So, what platform did you self-publish on?
So I use KDP.
KDP. Yeah. Were you pretty happy with it? Would you recommend it to other authors who are considering writing?
Yeah, you know what? I found their customer service was really good at the time that I was publishing. I'm not sure if they've been able to keep up the staffing now under the current conditions, but every time I needed to contact them about something, I was able to get someone on the line really quickly. And for me, it was also a comfort thing, just because the first book had been published that way on Amazon, so it was just easier. It was less of a learning curve. For my next works, I might do a little bit more research. I did start to do some research about other platforms, but honestly, it was just a matter of comfort, and they did end up giving me a good service, and I was happy with it.
Right, that's good to hear. Would you like to read to us?
Sure, I'm just going to grab a little bit of water.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
So this is actually taken from my first book, Theft by Chocolate.
Okay.
And I'm not going to do a setup for it. There's just a couple of characters, so it won't be too confusing. But it does take place near the end of the book, but I will stop at a place where no spoiler alert is required.
Okay, sounds good.
I won't ruin it for anyone, and also because it's a really good example of being able to share a part of the museum that most people do not know about. When I do readings at libraries, for example, people are usually shocked to find out about it, and it's the one thing that I often will get questions about. Is that real? It's very, very real, and I actually had pictures that I had taken of this place and was able to work from when I was writing this particular scene in my book. So here we go. I bolted from the office and passed through the doors on the other side of the gallery. I descended the staircase. I realized I'd forgotten to advise security I'd be setting off an alarm or two. Oh well, it was too late. They'd probably dispatched a floater to check the area already, so I'd have to apologize later for the breach. Upon arrival at the underground level of the curatorial center, I headed towards the prep labs. There were various rooms dedicated to everything from carpentry and welding to taxidermy. 1B7. Where was it? It had to be up ahead. Oh, there it was, 1B7, Ornithology Prep Lab. Why would Richard pick the bird preparation area? But since when did Richard do anything logical? I twisted the knob and the door opened. It was as black as road tar inside. Richard, are you here? There was no response. Great. Not only did he order me to meet in these bizarre surroundings, but he was late. I located a switch on the wall, and a single dim light was illuminated. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed a bag suspended above my head. I gazed up and saw a stuffed stork gripping a diaper bag in its beak. I guess that's what they consider ornithologist humor around here. It was impossible to avoid banging into things in the tight space. The room was jammed with fume hoods, desks, filing cabinets, and boxes. I walked over to a storage unit and pulled out a tray. Ooh, it was filled with countless specimens of small birds. I heard the museum was a repository for the 5,000 plus dead birds collected annually by FLAP. The Toronto Animal Rights Group gathered birds that had crashed into skyscrapers illuminated at night, and the museum took most of the sky kill off their hands for research purposes. But I never realized the museum had such an extensive and morbid morgue on site. I shoved the tray back in and noticed more ornithologist humor up ahead. Someone had cut out an image of the Grim Reaper and attached it to a dark blue metal door labeled Members Lounge. Above it, a sign written in calligraphy read, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." Well, if that wasn't an invitation to enter, what was? I slid the bolt across, cracked open the door, and stepped inside. A ghastly smell blasted me, and I turned to escape. But as I rotated, the door slammed in my face, and I heard the faint sound of metal scratching against metal. I reached for the knob, but the door refused to budge. Then something scampered across my feet, and I let out a blood-curdling scream. "Is anyone out there?" I pounded on the door. "Richard! Richard!" Nausea overcame me from the horrible odor that coated my nostrils and seeped into my lungs. I clutched the walls in search of a light switch, but they were clammy from the room's dense humidity. Finally, my fingers made contact with a small plastic lever, and my horrific surroundings were illuminated. Beside me rested a large filing cabinet, and atop it stood a white cross constructed of cardboard. The letters RIP were emblazoned on the cross, and someone had further embellished it with crude drawings of insects. I peered around and felt energy draining from my body as though it were being siphoned off. Down at my feet, boxes held decaying bird carcasses, dead rodents, and severed limbs of mammals. Masses of beetles fed on the rotting flesh, while others flitted about looking for their next meal. I was imprisoned inside the museum's infamous bug room. I knew about the bug room, but until this moment had not known where it was situated. I did know, however, it was inhabited by tens of thousands of carrion-eating insects used to turn animal carcasses into pristine skeletons. The 3 different variety of bugs could consume a small bird overnight, while larger animals such as a deer could take up to a month to be cleaned. I'd also been told that staff never spent more than 5 minutes in the impermeable container, as the bugs would begin to fly when the light was left on too long. Oh, the thought of a room filled with airborne flesh-eating beetles amplified my panic. I struck the light switch, blanketing the room with darkness again. God damn it, someone help me. I clobbered the door with my fist, all the while doubting my cries and pounding were audible beyond the room, let alone in the hallway. For a moment, I stopped to swipe my arms and legs. It appeared that if I kept in a state of motion, the bugs avoided me. The lifeless flesh in the boxes was apparently an easier meal ticket. But how long could I keep up the frenetic movement before passing out from the foul reek?
Very nice. Thank you.
So that's
The
the
bug
infamous
room.
bug room.
Wow. Okay, tell us about your upcoming event with Diana.
So I'm going to be doing a virtual event, obviously, and with Pages Promotions as a sort of they'll be hosting me. And it will include a couple of readings, but I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on the challenges of an independent author, and I know we've talked about it a little bit, but talking more about not just the challenges of the independent publishing, but the opportunities as well, because I just found that if you get creative, there's a lot of different ways that you can get your work in front of people. I've been very fortunate in that I've done library readings for both of my books, but I also really hustled, and especially with the first book and the word chocolate in the title, that kind of opened some unusual doorways for me, like at shops and or places that sold pastries and that sort of thing, where I did readings with smaller groups or small art galleries. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that whole process of, trying to find innovative ways to, or places where you could do readings, talk a little bit about some of my experiments with social media and what worked and what didn't. As you are aware, I recently finished a blog tour, so I had done one with my first book as well, so I thought I'd do it with this one. So I wanted to talk about those things. So I will talk about, at any of the events I do, I talk about my writing journey and publishing journey, because I feel that there's so many people with great stories out there, and they're sometimes intimidated and feel that they couldn't possibly do this themselves. So, if I tell them, well, someone like me did it, and so could you too. And just to encourage people to share their stories, I think it's really important. I mean, I know people make light of the fact that, everyone thinks they're a writer, or everyone thinks they're a photographer, or everyone thinks they're a musician, but we all have these, beautifully creative sides of ourselves. And I don't think there's anything wrong with more and more people getting into the marketplace with their work and their art.
Absolutely. How about your third book that you're planning or working on?
Yeah, so it's actually based on a screenplay that I had written about 10 years ago. So my first foray into writing, well, I shouldn't say my first, because I was doing some blogging, but it was all tied into my love of film. I used to always attend the Toronto International Film Festival, and as what I call a guerrilla film fester. So I would see 50 films in 10 days. And the friend who introduced me to the film festival ended up moving overseas. And so she wasn't able to attend anymore. So to sort of, she wanted to live the festival through me vicariously. So I started sending emails daily about the films I was seeing and the adventures I was having. And more and more people started finding out I was doing that. And that eventually morphed into a blog. At that time that I was doing the emails, the word blog didn't even exist. So, again, we have this progression of technology through my writing journey. And so I just really got hooked on writing. I had this audience, and I thought, geez, that kind of feels great sharing my stories, and people seem to enjoy them. I thought I had a little bit of a sense of humor, and people seem to enjoy having a little bit of light reading in their life. And so I decided to venture a little bit more deeply into writing, but I started first with screenwriting because I loved film so much, and I really, really enjoyed it tremendously. It's a different kind of writing, and I believe you do some screenwriting.
Yep. Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
So it's different. It's much more impressionistic, and there's you leave a lot of space for the visual to take over.
A lot more visual.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're writing scenes, which some authors started doing in their novels, using that same technique.
Yeah, exactly. But what I found after I had finished the story, I took it seriously enough. I was trying to see if I could find someone to pick it up, but didn't have any success. And then I really did fall in love with my own story, and I thought I wanted to flesh it out and bring much more depth to it. And so I had it on the back of my mind for years and years, but just never got around to it. I ended up then doing this coursework in novel writing and creative writing. And so the screenplay just sat for all this time. And I finally have this gap in my creative life at the moment. I decided to go back to the screenplay about characters who meet whose souls meet in different lifetimes and whose paths intersect. But the story has changed in some ways. It's great to have the bones that I have from the screenplay, so it's kind of as my structure. But I've changed the types of positions or employment that the characters do, because I wanted to sort of keep the museum theme, and I didn't have that in the screenplay originally.
Okay.
So it's going to revolve around a couple of characters, one of whom is a textiles conservator, and then a second one who is an intern at the museum, but they're working at the museum several decades apart, and so I'm going to intertwine the stories and bring this little bit of paranormal nature into it, because something that's always kind of fascinated me, and the soul journeys. And so I'm really excited. I'm not too far into it. I'm finding I'm having to do much more research than I did for my first two books. I'm obviously not a textiles conservator, so there are things about that I've been looking up, and so it's been a lot of fun getting into that. And I think it's going to be a very different kind of journey for me, and I will once again look at independently publishing it, most likely.
That sounds fascinating. Looking forward to it. And where can people see you in person this summer? if possible? Are you considering are you brave enough to consider an in-person event or?
You know what, Emma, I'm based in Toronto, and it's a hot spot here as far as the pandemic goes. We're the fourth largest city in North America, so really dense population. We've been on a pretty strict lockdown since it's just barely opening up in Toronto. And so they're already canceling again major events such as the Toronto International Film Festival, our documentary film festival. And I just recently received something from Word on the Street, which is our big book and magazine festival. And that takes place in the fall in September. And they're going virtual again too.
Again?
So there's at this point, there's no immediate openings. It doesn't look like in terms of doing live things. And, you know, in some ways I'm fine with it because I have been promoting this book for a while now, and I was really fortunate to get a number of virtual library readings, which a lot of authors don't always have that opportunity to do. But again, as an independent author, I sort of know that you have to hustle for these things, and I would send out, I think I sent out 50 to 55 emails to libraries with proposals, and I probably had a 10% return on that. But I did get these virtual events, which were great. But it's tough because there's so much content out there on the internet. Yes. I personally have a hard time keeping up with things, and so many courses that I'm wanting to do virtually and that sort of thing. So I probably will organically just kind of tail off the marketing for Theft Between the Rains. And I have made a conscious decision not to publish my next book until it is a more open world and I can do live events. My personal experience has been, even though people really enjoy the virtual events, that you don't get the same kind of book sales at when you're finished it. When you're in a library setting or a venue, as I mentioned, like in a sweet shop or an art gallery, there's that energy and immediate connection with the author, and people want that hard copy of a book and they want to watch you sign it in front of them. And however, when you get off a virtual event, all they have to do is hit their mouse and go on to the next virtual event, and the next one and the next one. So there hasn't been sort of the same kind of momentum in terms of getting your work out there that way. And so I've been blogging instead. I have a pandemic project that I've also been working on that I'm finding really satisfying as well, and just sort of focusing on that to develop a bigger audience and hopefully a bigger readership for when I do have the new book. And I probably, I'm not one of these people who madly writes 10,000 words a day. I'm a slow writer. I take my time. I have this philosophy that a story will be born when it's ready to be born.
Yes, absolutely.
So I don't fret about that, about when it comes out. So I'm happy to wait for a while until it does. But I don't know how you feel about that. I'm actually interested in your opinion on that.
I like to let the idea gel too. I don't jump really quickly into one, I do get dreams, but I don't necessarily get up the next morning and start immediately writing. I just let it process, and then more stuff enters into my head, and then somehow it starts coming together. I always call it as like putting the pieces of a puzzle together. Always.
For sure. And I'm in a place where now I'm not working full time anymore. Before I used to have a full-time job and was teaching yoga, and I'm doing neither at the moment. And so I have the luxury to meditate in the mornings and do yoga or a little bit of cardio. And so like you, I kind of like to, I like to, I guess, ideate, I guess is the word. Think about things, and then I usually leave my writing sort of to the afternoon and early evenings. And with my blogging, it's just an idea that came to me from living in such a small space in my condo here in Toronto. It's just 350 square feet, and although I think I must have been in some sort of monastic environment in a previous life or something, because I've actually been feeling very comfortable and really quite liked it. But I started becoming more aware because I had to downsize actually a few times before I got to this smaller space. They were conscious decisions as I journeyed through my life. But I'm becoming much more aware of particular things that I have continued to hold on to and not gotten rid of in a garage sale or just giving it away. So I'm letting the things in my place inspire little stories, and have started this series that I promote on Facebook and Instagram. And if you go to my website, you can also find links to my blog, or the page with my blog, called A Nebulous Number of Days of Automity and Memory. So just how little things in my place have triggered memories that I haven't thought of in a long time. And I've been finding that it's really been helping with my writing craft, because it's been a while since I've been writing, because I finished Theft Between the Rains. It's already been at least a year and a half now, so I'm writing a lot. So I'm finding that the blogging has been great for that, and really sort of developing or bringing my skills back up again. So
yeah, I agree. I love blogging. Just love it.
Yeah.
All right. Would you like to give us your parting shot?
Yes. What I decided to do for that is here in Canada, and I remember you told me that you lived in Canada for a while. So this is a tradition that has started more in recent years in terms of acknowledging that the land that we are living and working on. And I would like to take the opportunity to do that.
Thank you.
So I encourage you to reflect on the history of the land that you are watching from. I am speaking to you from my home in Toronto, a Mohawk word which translates to where the trees meet the water, or the gathering place. Toronto is bound by Dish with One Spoon, a treaty between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee to share the territory, promote peace, and protect the land. I acknowledge them and any other nations who care for the land, recorded and unrecorded, and I pay my respect to Canada's first storytellers.
Beautiful. Thank you, Luba. Thank you very much. Thank you for the interview, and have a great career. And I'm sure we'll see each other.
And we'll be in touch. I feel like
we'll be in touch.
Good friends.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma. Take care.